2021, I did a show with Daniel Sokatch, who is the CEO of the New Israel Fund. He, at the time, had a book out called Can We Talk About Israel? With a question mark, a guide for the curious, confused, and conflicted. It's an organization and I think a book designed for progressive people, particularly progressive Jews. He has, in the last 4 years, of course, much has happened, much drama, much tragedy, and particularly much controversy. Interestingly enough, Daniel and his publisher Bloomsbury have come out with a new edition, revised and updated 4 years later, and I'm thrilled that Daniel is joining us. He's a neighbor of mine in San Francisco, but he's joining us from his San Francisco office of New Israel Fund in downtown San Francisco. Daniel, it's been quite a 4 years, hasn't it?
It really has. It's good to be back with you, Andrew.
So tell me what is your take, both as Daniel Sokatch and also the New Israel Fund? What is your take on what's happened over the last 4 years?
Well, I think the way I would describe it is that, I end the book. The book ends chronologically with the election of what was called the Change Government, which was an alternative to the Netanyahu-run coalitions that have dominated the last, all but a year or so of the last 17 or 18 years. And that government collapsed after a year, and it was replaced by an extreme right-wing government led again by Netanyahu. But this time he had burned so many of his bridges to moderates and even kind of people I would call the reasonable right, that he was forced to put together a government made up of three parts. What I like to call the MAGA rump of his Likud party. A lot of people had left the Likud over Netanyahu and the scandals and political controversies that he'd been involved in. So what was left was a cult of personality that resembles today's Republican Party. Then the second constituency was the ultra-Orthodox political parties, which often are comfortable in a government with him. And then finally, for the first time, extremist right-wing settler parties who are described often as Jewish supremacist parties. The leader of one of them is now the finance minister, a guy called Bezalel Smotrich, who once bragged that he was a proud fascist and a proud homophobe. The leader of another one is a guy called Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's the minister of national security now. He was arrested multiple times on incitement to terror. So that's who is the government of the state of Israel. And when they came together and they launched the government in early 2023, they had a common enemy. And that enemy was the one body in the state of Israel that really could provide a check on their ultra right-wing political agenda. And that was the High Court of Justice, or Supreme Court of the state of Israel. And so they launched what the Israeli press called a judicial coup, an attempt to really neuter the independence of the High Court of Justice. So that was sort of catastrophe one. And it was met, to the surprise of everybody, with a ferocious and very effective pushback from civil society, which New Israel Fund was proud to play a leading role in. And ultimately, those hundreds of thousands of protesters who were out on the streets every week managed to shove a stick in the spoke of authoritarianism that these judicial, quote unquote, reforms were meant to introduce, which again was the neutering of the High Court of Justice's ability to stop government policy, to review, to apply judicial review. There were mass protests. The defense minister threatened to resign, warned that the country was divided, and that this terrible move was giving Israel's enemies ideas about the vulnerability and weakness of society. Ultimately, civil society managed to stop the most egregious till now of those judicial reforms, which is interesting when you parallel it to what's happening in our country. But on October 7th came the second catastrophe, because the defense minister was right and Hamas launched its brutal, monstrous attack. 1,200 Israelis murdered, hundreds taken hostage and spirited back to Gaza, at which point Israel unleashed a war. At first, Israel, of course, had the backing of most of the world, but its response was so disproportionate ultimately in the eyes of much of the world, 67,000 Palestinians killed, that it really lost a lot of its diplomatic support. It became isolated, and even after Netanyahu's government and the IDF managed to neutralize Iran as an enemy, destroy Hezbollah, the militia in Lebanon, and which directly led to or contributed to the fall of the Assad dictatorship in Syria, that those were the biggest players in Iran's so-called resistance axis, its axis of resistance. Even after the Israeli army successfully decapitated the axis of resistance, it still was isolated diplomatically because of the way it conducted its war in Gaza. So in short, the last 4 years have been endless, cascading, catastrophic crises in Israel and the region.
Yeah, and I don't think what you're saying is that different from what a lot of people think. You run this organization called the New Israel Fund. You said it's funded, before we went live, it's funded by donors, small donors, some large. You have over 200 people working for you, 3 offices in Israel, 5 in the US, some in Europe, 1 in Canada. Have you had your own crisis, Daniel, thinking, why am I doing this? Why would I be even wanting to talk about what many people now believe is simply a fascist state? And as you say, there are maybe not a majority, but certainly a significant minority of Jews in Israel who embrace the idea of fascism and violence and hatred against Arabs and wanting to wipe them out. What's been your own personal narrative over the last 4 years?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the candor of the question, Andrew. And I suppose my answer is, even before I worked at New Israel Fund, when I was a donor and a supporter since I graduated from college, NIF, as we call it, was the vehicle that I and tens of thousands of other people had to push back against the very dynamic that you just described. So over the last 4 years, NIF has, of course, been demonized by the Israeli government and the right wing and its supporters in beyond Israel, and including in the current situation here in the United States, as an organization that supports liberal democracy, human rights, equality for Jews and Arabs, and an end to the occupation. These are unpopular things in much of Israel and beyond, but I am extremely proud to lead an organization that stands for an alternative and that represents another way. So yes, it's terribly painful the last 4 years. And, as an American, there are times, including now, where it's terribly painful to see what my country is doing in my name. And I'm proud to support those organizations that are pushing back against that are saying, no, not in our name. That's not who we are. And that is what we are in Israel, and for many people around the world who support a different vision of Israel. So it's been heartbreaking, but I'm very proud to be one of the leaders of the democratic, anti-fascist pushback against what's happening there.
So none of this has undermined I assume you're, Daniel, a Zionist. You believe in the idea of a state of Israel. None of this has undermined your Zionism, your fundamental belief that the Jewish people should have a state of their own.
It's funny because I just wrote a piece about Zionism, and I write a bit about it in the book. And what I say is, Zionism as a word, as a term, has a meaning, which is the 19th century nationalist movement and the idea behind that movement that the Jewish people require self-determination in their ancient homeland of what we now call Israel. So that's what Zionism is. And Zionism has come to mean in the current discourse so many things to so many people. People accuse me or ask suspiciously, are you a Zionist? People, other people in Israel ask equally suspiciously, are you a Zionist? Doubting whether I am. But what they mean and what the person in the in the anti-Israel camp means are different things. And neither of those things is that initial meaning. So when people ask me if I'm a Zionist, you know what I say now? I say, I can't answer that question because I don't know what you mean, and you don't know what I mean by the word. And if a word means so many different things to so many different people, it doesn't really mean much of anything. So here's the deal. Ask me any question you want, and I will answer you honestly. answer. You can ask me if I support Israel, if I think the current Israeli societal structure is fair, whether there should be a state that privileges Jews, whether Israel's right to do X, Y, or Z. We can debate it, discuss it, but it'll be a more useful conversation than me responding to a label. So what I would say is,
let me come back on that, Daniel.
What do you mean by Zionism?
You deal with this on a daily basis, but it seems to me that if you're dodging the question on Zionism, if you're saying, well, it's a term that means so many different things to so
I'm not dodging it.
Let me finish.
Yeah.
That if it's a term that means so many different things to so many different people that I'm not comfortable using the term or responding to it or discussing it, then what's the whole point of Israel as a state?
Well, I guess what I don't mean to dodge. I don't intend to dodge the question.
Well, you are dodging the question in the sense that I asked you if you were a Zionist, and you said, "Well, it's not a question I want to answer."
No. But what do you mean by the question? Just ask me what you mean.
What I mean by the question is, should, as you noted earlier, should there be, or should the Jews have a state of their own?
Yeah,
which is the foundation of the Zionist promise, dream, political.
I believe
political experiment, and some people think it's a tragedy.
Yeah, that question I can answer clearly. I absolutely believe that the Jewish people deserve to have self-determination in their ancient homeland. I also believe that by the lights of their own Declaration of Independence, that state must provide complete equality to all of its citizens, regardless of their national origin, their ethnicity, their race, or their gender, which is laid out there in the 14th paragraph of Israel's Declaration of Independence. So the reason I nitpick about this is because sometimes when people say, "Are you a Zionist?" they mean, "Do you approve of the war in Gaza, or do you approve of a state that privileges Jews under the law over other people?" And I don't approve of either of those things, but I do believe and support the idea that the Jews, like every other people, have a right to a place of greater safety and self-determination. And I think Jewish history provides a lot of evidence that was and perhaps remains a necessary thing for the Jewish people. So the question for me is, what kind of Israel are we talking about? Not whether or not there's a right to be in Israel. For sure, Israel has a right to exist, and it exists. The question is, what kind of country is it going to be?
There's always been a debate, though, hasn't there, about Zionism? I mean, Jabotinsky, the progressive Zionists, the leftist Zionists, Begin, Netanyahu. So the debate that you're getting involved with isn't new. Is that fair?
It is fair. In fact, you correctly stated there were what they called themselves revisionist Zionists like Jabotinsky, who were right-wing Zionists. There were left-wing socialist Zionists like Ben-Gurion. And then there were what was called cultural Zionists, like the thinker Echad Ha'am in the 19th century, or Martin Buber, or the founder of the Hebrew University, Judah Magnus. And these people were they were sort of binationalists. They believed that that in Israel had to exist for the Jewish people, but that it should be a state that provided complete and totally, that didn't privilege Jews over Palestinians. So there have been many flavors of Zionism, and I think what we've seen is that one of those, like two of them competed for a long time, and one of them has really emerged dominant over the last quarter century or so.
So let me revise the question. So given your definition of what kind of Zionist you are, and given the reality on the ground in Israel today, can you remain a Zionist?
Well, look, I don't know the answer to that question in the long term. I know that.
Well, in the short term today,
I think it's a fight worth fighting, right? I think, like, for me in Israel, that continues down the trajectory that it's in now, becoming increasingly an ethno-nationalist, religious state, is not one that I feel connected to. But of course, or want to support or preserve. But of course, there is a different vision for the country, and really, I do think there's an analog here, where what we see in America today is a vision of the country that I fundamentally oppose. It's starker than it's ever been before. And but if you ask if I'm a patriotic American, well, I am. But my patriotism is to sort of founding ideals and ideas, and what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, not towards the the kind of inward-looking, brutal, bullying MAGA America that we currently are experiencing. And I think that that's a good analogy to Israel, where nothing about the current government of the state, that's a ferocious Israel that does not resonate with me at all. But I still think that there's a different future and an alternative vision that is worth fighting for. So I can remain a proponent of that, even as I really oppose the policies and direction and actions of the current government of the state of Israel, and perhaps, a plurality of its voters.
I have to admit, I'm not convinced by this argument. I mean, making this direct comparison with Trump's America seems, I don't know whether you're doing an injustice to America or you're sanitizing Israel, but comparing a war which has killed whatever it is, 60, 70, 80,000 civilians, and what Trump is doing, which is picking on enemies and annoying everyone all the time by posting stupid things on social media. Are they really equivalent, Daniel? Is the state of Trump's America and the state of Netanyahu's Israel, are they similar?
No, I don't think they're equivalent, and that's why I said it's an analogy. I don't think it's an equivalency. But I think that, and by the way, this is not what we're here to talk about, but there are troops in American cities. There are mass deportations. They're blowing up boats in the Caribbean, bullying and threatening our allies. But leaving all that aside, I don't think it's an equivalency. I think, again, it's an analogy of states that take a wild autocratic turn. In the case of Israel, I think just as the Hamas attack on Israel was unjustifiable and monstrous, so too has Israel's response, or rather the level of Israel's response. And that is something that puts me at odds with a lot of people in my community. The former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, has said publicly, it is quite clear that Israel is committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I think that's an inescapable conclusion when you see the way Israel conducted this war. And so, the question that you're asking, does that mean that you sever your ties with the place? That's a real question, and I appreciate it. I suppose my answer is I still want to fight for a different kind of future for that place, but not to defend what it is now.
So if Israel is indeed, as you've said, you seem to acknowledge, committing war crimes, today we're talking on October the 22nd. This will go out in the next few days. Today, a number of very prominent Jews around the world called on the UN and world leaders to sanction Israel. Some of the people who signed this include the former Speaker of the Knesset, Avraham Berg, authors, the Canadian writer Naomi Klein, Jonathan Glazer, who made Zone of Interest, his wife, Ilana Glazer. Would you sign that? Do you think if Israel is indeed committing war crimes, which seems relatively self-evident, that you, as a prominent Jewish figure, the CEO of the New Israel Fund, should support sanctioning Israel?
Well, by the way, two of those names that you read, Avram Borg, the former Speaker of the Knesset, and Daniel Levy, former peace negotiator, are former NIF board members and people who I'm quite close to. Look, I believe that, for example, my country, the United States, should follow its own laws. And we have laws on the books that Congress has passed that say we should not be sending offensive weapons to countries that are violating human rights norms and committing war crimes. And I would absolutely support the application of those laws in the case of Israel or any other American ally that is breaking our own laws. And it seems to me pretty clear that the way Israel has used its munitions and the way its assault on Gaza has been conducted is violative of those laws. Now, the fact that two presidents in a row are not going to pay any attention to that and are going to defend whatever Israel does is immaterial. And in the opinion of many people, including myself, Israel has violated those laws, the Hatch Act and others, and I would support Congress.
So to interrupt a rather long answer to a simple question, yes or no, would you sign this call to sanction Israel for its war crimes?
Well, again, I haven't read that call, but and we invest in Israel, that's what New Israel Fund
maybe you
does.
Personally, maybe now you can't necessarily speak on New Israel Fund, but you as an American Jew.
Well, again, I'm not trying to be legalistic here, but I haven't read the call, so you can't ask me to sign something I haven't read. But I don't.
Well, okay, let's revise it again. What
Yeah.
would you sign in terms of sanctioning Israel?
So I would have no problem. I agree with those people who are calling for us to suspend offensive aid to Israel if it doesn't act in accordance with American law and policy and human rights norms. I'd have no problem supporting that. And frankly, you know, depending on what, again, what that letter says, I would sign something saying that that we should not, as the United States of America, continue to support offensive actions in Gaza by sending munitions and weapons to the Israelis.
Let's get to the book, Daniel. Came out in 2021. Can we talk about Israel? A guide for the curious, confused, and conflicted. I mean, back in October 2021, it was a remarkably controversial subject, a kind of progressive defense of Israel. Many people on the left have been accused themselves of being anti-Semitic in their criticism of Israel. What's the new edition? What are you saying that in this revised and updated version that you didn't say before for the curious, confused, and conflicted? What's changed?
Well, the real edition is about 75 pages that try to, almost 100 pages that try to bring us up to where we are now, or rather where we were. I believe the narrative ends with the American bombing of Iran. So what is that? Back in the spring. So it really is intended to sort of bring the narrative up to date and sort of the analysis that I provide of what happened and why it happened. A word about what you're set up for that question. I think that this allegation or the conflation of being anti-Israel, or as you might say, anti-Zionist, as you know, I don't like the term because of its impreciseness, but the term of the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism or anti-Israel sentiment is a pernicious one. And of course, what makes it so hard is that sometimes people who really don't like Jews use criticism of Israel as a way of expressing that. And sometimes people who are criticizing Israel conflate Israel and the Jews and blame Jews for what Israel does. That's anti-Semitism right there. It's prima facie anti-Semitism. But those who criticize Israel, even strongly, even witheringly, right? Those who believe Israel's committing genocide or ethnic cleansing, or who argue for Israel to be sanctioned or for aid to be cut off to Israel, are not necessarily anti-Semitic. They are watching in real time something horrific. And whether or not we agree with them, or whether we think they have all the right nuances, or whether they've gotten their analysis correct, I would strongly protest the allegation that all of those people, because of their harsh criticism of Israel, are anti-Semites. The mayoral race in New York is a great current example of a person who's being tarred with anti-Semitism as an anti-Semite in Mamdani, who, as far as I can see, hasn't evidenced any anti-Semitic.
Right, and another interesting op-ed today, you probably already read it, by Brett Stevens. He was on the show a few years ago.
Yeah.
I guess a conservative Zionist, an American conservative Zionist, although a very intelligent, well-educated one, argues that Mamdani, and he's writing as an American Jew, makes him very nervous. I'm assuming you don't agree with him on that.
No, I don't agree with him on that. And I didn't agree with anything in that op-ed, except for that clearly Mamdani does make some American Jews nervous, and I have compassion for that.
And I'm even more than skeptical, rather uncomfortable with the word nervous, given the fate of the 80 or whatever it is, 70 or 80,000 dead Palestinians in Gaza. The idea of a nervous American Jew is not something that I'm going to lose much sleep over.
Well, I mean, the fact is, Mamdani doesn't like Israel, and that is the thing that Stephen says makes him nervous. But of course, what he doesn't write in that article, when he writes about, what he says to be a singular focus on Israel, he doesn't mention what he well knows, which is that, why doesn't Mamdani support sanctioning other countries? Well, those countries aren't the largest recipients of American aid. Our taxpayer money is not necessarily supporting other repressive regimes, and certainly not supporting repressive regimes in places like Russia and China. They're not our ally and largest recipient of aid. He also doesn't mention a word about the 750,000 Israeli settlers who have been who have been moved into the West Bank in an attempt at de facto annexation of that territory, and the now, what is it, 60 years almost of Palestinians living in the West Bank having no civil rights and no citizenship. So, it's very easy for him to talk about how nervous people are without actually putting forth the reasons why someone like Mamdani is opposed to Israel in the way that he is.
Right, and Stevens isn't conflicted. You're not writing for him. You're writing this book for the
us.
curious. I mean, I'm not sure. I think most curious people have given up. They've got other things to be curious about. But certainly confusion and confliction are central, particularly the conflicted. Do you think that over the last 4 years, people should be more or less conflicted?
I would hope that they're more conflicted in that they're whatever side you're on. Here, let me just speak to American Jews for a minute, right? There is this instinct that
Let me say that again. You're talking for who?
I'm going to speak to American Jews in answering your question. Right?
Okay.
I would hope that Palestinian Americans and others would undertake a similar sort of reflection. But let me just speak for the community I come from. Too often this conflict has been presented as, two sides, you've got to choose a side. And I think that's fundamentally, that needs to be reevaluated in the wake of Gaza, right? I think it always should have been reevaluated. But, on October 8th, a board member of the New Israel Fund, who was a Palestinian citizen of Israel and an emergency room doctor, said to me that when she was in the emergency room at Soroka, the largest hospital in the South, and when she was there treating, kibbutznikim and Bedouin and soldiers, all the victims of the attack, she had this moment looking around the emergency room where she said, the sides are not Israelis versus Palestinians or Arabs versus Jews. It's those who believe violence is a means to achieve their ends and those who believe that human rights are more important. And that is the side that I find myself on. That's my side. My side isn't Israel or Palestine. It isn't Arab or Jew. It's those people who believe in human rights and humanity and compassion versus those who say, well, in defense of my group, this was excusable. And my hope is that people will feel conflicted by what they're seeing and they will reevaluate how they see themselves and what side they're choosing, and that they choose the side of human rights and compassion, regardless of what tribe they come from.
I mean, that goes without saying, Daniel. You don't need to be in the New Israel Fund to say that. I mean, it's all very well being conflicted and confused and curious, but ultimately, isn't this about power? Both sides have good arguments in terms of why they're there, what their rights should be, what their state should be. But ultimately, the issue here is who holds power, and 99.9% of that power, probably 100%, is, for better or worse, with the Israeli state.
Yep. Agreed.
So why even waste our time dealing with the moral issues?
Well, you don't have to. You can choose not to. But for those of us who say we're not ready to abandon this idea, we're not ready to sever ties to, half of the global Jewish community, and we may feel a sense of responsibility for what is done in the name of the Jewish people through what Israel does. This seems to many of us to be a worthy fight to fight. I mean, you don't like it when I make analogies to America, but you could have argued the same thing, before the Civil War, during the collapse of Reconstruction. What's the point? The bad guys have all the power. But I think the point is you keep working for a different future, a different horizon. You don't give up because the bad guys are in control right now.
Well, I don't agree. Again, I mean, the bad guys didn't they held some power during the revolution. They certainly didn't hold all the power during the Civil War. But anyway, you have a good ear, access to the American Jewish community at New Israel Fund. That's your constituency. A couple of questions on this. Firstly, there have been some pieces in the New York Times, which is relatively sympathetic to Israel, recently about a shift amongst American Jews towards Israel, particularly in the wake of the Gaza invasion. Is that true, do you think?
I absolutely think it's true. The polling that we're seeing, the data that is, that derives from Gallup and other folks doing polling, tends to confirm it, that there is a sea change in the way the American Jewish community is relating to Israel. and not just in the Jewish community. The vast majority of Democrats now say they disapprove of Israel. They don't want, they don't support Israel. A quarter of American Jews say that they think Israel's an apartheid state. Young evangelicals are increasingly opposed to Israel, and this is, largely the result not of anti-Semitism. That's not why American Jews are moving away from Israel. They're moving away from Israel is because they do not recognize this place as a place with values that they can share and that they can support. So yeah, I see it and I understand it. In a sense, NIF is fighting for an alternative Israel. And as you say, for a lot of people, that's not a fight that they're interested in having anymore.
And that's quite surprising in a way, given how little information on the ground has come out about what's happened in Gaza. I mean, what is going to happen once the media gets into Gaza, which will eventually happen, and we get the stories of the mass death, of the starvation, of everything else that's been happening? I mean, you talk about 25% of American Jews giving up on Israel, or certainly becoming more skeptical. What's it going to take for the next 25 or 50% to turn like that first quarter?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's much bigger. The number I cited were people who say they think Israel's an apartheid state. So the number of people who disapprove or turn away from it is even greater than that. And I think that, as you're suggesting, when we really see what's happening on the ground, what's happened on the ground in Israel, it is going to shock the conscience of a lot of people. And, that Israel still has the government that carried out this war in power. If it still has that government in power when these revelations are made, I think it's going to go very badly for Israel in terms of its support in the American Jewish community and throughout the American community, right? Like, however hypocritical it may or may not be, Israel, we judge Israel to a different standard. It has described itself as the only democracy in the Middle East. It says it is a Western power. When it is seen not to be acting like one, or at least not to be acting the way we all think that Western powers should act, it is going to pay. It is already, there are consequences for that. And it is paying the price for that in increasing diplomatic isolation and unpopularity. And I think it will only, this will only be amplified when, as you say, reporters finally get on the grounds and see what, as you know, I believe to be evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
The book is so well titled, Daniel, particularly in the last 4 years, Can We Talk About Israel? Because, of course, it could equally apply to the United States, where the current administration seems to want to make talk about Israel, or at least critical talk about Israel, illegal or semi-illegal on campuses. What's your take on what's happened in America with this hysteria about criticism of Israel? How do you make sense of it within the Trump administration?
Well, I think they're undertaking a very cynical weaponization of the idea of anti-Semitism to carry out policies that have nothing to do with Israel or anti-Semitism at all. Specifically their assault on higher education under the guise of fighting anti-Semitism, when the vast majority of the so-called anti-Semitism that they're citing are protesters against Israel's actions, who definitely there are plenty of examples of nasty anti-Semitic incidents that have taken place at those protests. But by and large, that has not been the way they've been a correct characterization of the protests. And so I think they are using the wedge issue of anti-Semitism as a camouflage for a crackdown, or to paraphrase the president of Harvard, when they came after Harvard's federal support. I'm not really sure, I won't get the exact quote, but he said something to the effect of, why in the world does cutting tens of millions of dollars of grants into cancer research and other medical benefits, how does that stop anti-Semitism? Or how does that fight anti-Semitism? So I think it's a totally disingenuous move on their part that is just part of their neo-authoritarian agenda. And I think it's a terrible thing. And, I think the majority of American Jews who vote Democratic will continue to do so, and who see through that. Even American Jews who really do have fears of anti-Semitism, rising anti-Semitism. I will point out that the most lethal attacks of anti-Semitism, or examples of anti-Semitism in recent years, have been perpetrated by radical right-wingers who have slaughtered Jews in their synagogues, and at Nazi marches, and chanted for "Jews will not replace us" at Nazi marches. And yes, there have been incidents of violence, even murder, by people shouting "Free Palestine," but that is not an equivalent to the kind of neo-Nazi support that some of the look. Just this morning, I'm sure you saw this too. A Trump appointee had to pull himself out, or Trump dropped an appointee when it came out that he had made pro-Nazi statements. When the Young Republicans the other day, it was revealed by Politico, had made all kinds of racist and pro-Nazi statements. I mean, this is the real threat to American Jews, not protests against Israel on college campuses.
Yeah, it's a kind of surreal situation, Daniel, because on the one hand, you have this rise of neo-Nazism and on the American right, more and more overt revisionism on Hitler and the Holocaust. But some of these people seem quite sympathetic to Israel.
Yeah.
How do those two things square?
It's so surreal. Do you remember, what's his name? I think it's Richard Spencer.
Yeah.
The organizer, the Charlottesville guy, right? I saw an interview where he said something along the lines of, yes, well, I'm a Zionist. I don't believe Jews have any place here in my country, the white Christian United States of America, but I support them going back to Israel and kicking out, the Palestinians there. That's the Jewish homeland. So in this sense, they are allies, ideological allies of Smotrich and Ben Gvir and even Netanyahu, right? This is an Israeli government that cozies up with actual Jew haters, so long as they support, the blood and soil nationalism of the current Israeli government. And the best example was before October 7th, when Orban, one of Trump's favorites and one of Netanyahu's favorites, Orban's party in Hungary ran ads in a parliamentary election that were right out of the pages of Der Stürmer. They were Nazi-style anti-Jewish imagery, focusing on George Soros, everyone's favorite villain for those guys. And the Jewish community of Budapest went to the Israeli ambassador and said, look, this is very worrying. Can you say something? And so the Israeli ambassador wrote a very respectful letter to Orban asking him to take action and stop this. And Netanyahu ordered his ambassador to recall the letter, right? Because he didn't want anyone causing trouble with his pal Orban, even if Orban's party is terrifying and frightening local Jews. So long as he supports this hard right-wing blood and soil vision of Israel, they're happy to be in bed together. And so that's why Richard Spence, look, the Minister for Diaspora Affairs in Israel, a guy called Amichai Chikli, just invited one of your fellow countrymen, I think his name is Tommy Robinson.
Yeah, Tommy Robinson,
he invited him to Israel as his guest. This is a known anti-Semite, a Jew hater, but it's okay because he supports the right-wing government of Israel in its fight against Palestinians and all other perceived enemies. And that's the topsy-turvy, surreal world that we're in.
And the shocking world, although, again, thinking out loud, I think Eichmann at his trial claimed that he was a Zionist. So there were some Zionists, at least amongst the Nazis. They simply wanted to rid Europe of the Jews, and they'd be happy to dump them on Palestine or anywhere else in the world.
Like Richard Spencer, same thing. Yeah.
This is all rather depressing, to say the least, Daniel. I'm surprised you still have any hair. You look as if you're at least sleeping and you're eating. I mean, what's there to remain in any way hopeful about? I mean, for the curious, the confused, and the conflicted, where's the evidence that anything can change here? I mean, is the recent ceasefire, although it seems a very tentative one, a very tenuous one, is that any reason to believe that this terrible, terrible, dark, catastrophic episode, not just, of course, Gaza, but the Hamas mass killing beforehand, the Hamas pogrom, that this might be the light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, look, in the short term, right, the reason there is a ceasefire is because of the president of the United States, who demanded it, who ordered it. And I've written and said Netanyahu was not going to end the war unless and until the pressure to do so was more than the pressure he felt from his coalition members to keep the war going. And that benefited him, keeping the war going. Most Israelis, by the way, agree with that analysis. Once Trump said, no, you're not going to, you're ending it, he ended it. Because, of course, an American president can always get a client state to do what he wants or she wants it to do. So if Trump remains engaged, it could be that this does result in a real end to at least this round. But unless the fundamental underlying issues are dealt with, which is, how do you create a reality where Palestinians have some hope of a future of dignity and respect and freedom, and Israelis have hope of a future of security, then this will just be the latest awful round, as you say, in this nightmare. I think in the medium term, I think when you said how can you hope? You asked why I still have hair. What the listeners can't see is that my hair is gray, and it wasn't when I started the job. But there, I think you are a prominent enough curious cynic that you won't like this answer, but I'll say it anyway because for me, it's true. In the medium term, history doesn't always go the way you think it's going to go. And before, the Berlin Wall fell or Gorbachev, declared glasnost and perestroika, before F.W. de Klerk opened the doors on the gates at Robben Island, before Sadat flew to Jerusalem, before Rabin said enough, no one would have predicted that those things happened. Before, in Northern Ireland, before people said, we've got to stop. And so for me, the hope is that yes, if things continue along this terrible path, there's not a lot of hope. But sometimes, new opportunities arise, and people like the figures I named arise. And it would be, in my opinion, hubris, or as we would say, chutzpah, to think, no, that can't happen here. I mean, it's happened in just as tough and difficult situations before. And the role of civil society, where New Israel Fund works, is to prepare the ground and to make sure there is enough hope left and enough infrastructure of civil society to be able to support that kind of a change when it comes in the last.
Give me you said it's happened before. Give me one example, a comparison, an equivalent.
Well, I mean, again, I don't know that it's an equivalent. I think it's an analogy, right? Or at least it's a reason for hope. Look at the end of apartheid, and the fact that that a leader arose and he said, for lots of different geopolitical reasons, it's not feasible to continue this way. And so he let Mandela out of jail, and then things took their course there. Or let's go closer to home. Sadat, after the 73 Yom Kippur War, flies to Jerusalem and says, look, you've all told yourself that there's no hope of living in peace with us, but I'm telling you, give us back the Sinai settlements and make peace with the Palestinians, and we can all live together in peace. And so these are examples of what could be. But at the end of the day, Andrew, there's about 15 million people, half of them Jews, half of them Palestinians, who live between the river and the sea, right? In Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. And none of them are going anywhere, despite the fever dream fantasies of Hamas and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And despite, Trump's dabbling with the Gaza Riviera, giving the crazy right wing in Israel hope until he says, of course, I didn't really mean that. No one's going anywhere. So for me, the hope comes from doing everything I can to support Israelis and Palestinians who are trying to change their reality and build something better and new. And I don't have the hubris to say, well, that's impossible, it's never going to happen, because these things have changed in other places, in Northern Ireland, in South Africa.
But in Northern Ireland, I just don't buy the equivalence. I mean, sometimes peace happens. It happened in Bosnia. It happened in Northern Ireland. It happened in a way in Cyprus. But they're entirely different situations. I wonder, the one analogy that I do think is interesting is the one with apartheid. You talked about Mandela being let out of prison. In terms of using New Israel Fund to actually shape what's happening in Israel, what about the argument that more pressure should be put on Israel to let Barghouti out of jail in Israel, so that at least the Palestinians have an alternative to the gerontocracy in the current political administration or the lunatics in Hamas?
I would agree with that 100%. And it's in the interest of the lunatics in Hamas and the ethno-nationalist supremacist government in Jerusalem to not have Barghouti out of jail. And for that matter, it's probably the interest in the gerontocracy of the PA not to have him out of jail.
So why aren't the progressives around the world turning Barghouti, who seems a smart figure with a degree of dignity, why aren't we turning him into Mandela? I mean, Mandela wasn't really Mandela.
Right. Well, first of all, I don't think most people know who we're talking about.
Well, maybe say something about him for our audience, for the curious, confused, and conflicted who don't know much about Marwan Barghouti.
So Marwan Barghouti, as who Andrew has mentioned, is a Palestinian leader who was associated with the PLO, with Fatah, that is to say, not Hamas, the secular Palestinian Liberation Organization, which ultimately signed the White House lawn accords with Israel under President Clinton. And Barghouti was a young, up-and-coming guy in the Second Intifada, very charismatic and considered to be a pragmatist within that polity. He was jailed by Israel, held responsible for murders that were done during the Second Intifada, and has been a threat to all three of the parties that I just named. Hamas, the current Palestinian Authority leadership, and the Israeli government, because the conventional wisdom and what Andrew and I are positing is that this is the kind of person who could be a Mandela, possibly, we don't know, but a Mandela-like figure, in that people believe in,
or even a Jerry Adams-like figure who may not be a saint, but at least is willing to come to the table.
Yes, and he has indicated that he is willing to come to the table, and he's very popular amongst Palestinians, and so as to why progressives around the world don't make him a Mandela-like figure, A, they don't know who he is. B, I would suggest that many progressives who criticize Israel and protest on behalf of Palestinian rights, often don't do the deep dive into understanding what's actually happening there. But I think that, the fact that you've got three parties that would not like to see Barghouti released, and they're the three major players on the ground, is a good indication of why I agree with you that a potentially transformative move might be releasing Barghouti and allowing him, as a more moderate and beloved Palestinian leader, who is, it's funny, we're talking about 66-year-olds as the young generation, but there we are, who could represent a new chapter in a reformed Palestinian Authority that could actually provide an alternative to Hamas and to the corruption of the current Palestinian Authority. Like, they don't want him out because he could, in fact, be that way, provide that vehicle. So that's why I think people like you and I would love to see an opportunity for someone like that to be the bridge builder into some kind of a new reality.
Finally, Daniel, we haven't talked since October 21. So in 4 years' time, it will be 2029, October 29. I mean, obviously, it's impossible to tell what's going to be happening in November 2025, let alone October 2029. But, I mean, if we're still in this situation then, well, a lot of people have already written off the two-state solution just because it's inconceivable given what's happened on the ground in terms of the carving up of land. Is it conceivable for you that by 2029 you would have just said enough? I don't believe this thing can work anymore, and that we're going to dismantle the new Israel fund and go off and do something else? Well,
in 2029, I would have been at the New Israel Fund for 21 years, which is probably too long for anyone to be the CEO of anything. So my hope is that my successor, whoever she or he is at that point in time, or if it's still me, if things are exactly where they are now. I mean, we haven't, our conversations haven't really been about what New Israel Fund is or does at any level of at any granular level, but we have shifted and changed our strategies over the years to embrace the new realities that the changing landscape reveals to us. And if things are where they are now or worse in 2029, I think it is quite clear that a new strategy is called for. And, whether that is saying, look, the only watchword we have now is equality. There's 15 million people, and they just need to have equality. And we will support efforts peaceful efforts to bring about that equality, regardless of whether it's in a two-state solution, a one-state solution, a federation, or a confederation. That's already largely the position of the New Israel Fund. But I would say that if in 4 years things are where they are now or worse, then that would have to become increasingly the focus of this operation.
But none of those are viable. I mean, isn't that the problem? I know I sound a little negative here, but a one-state solution won't work because of the deep hatred between the two peoples. A two-state solution doesn't seem to be geographically viable. I don't know what the other options are.
Well, I don't think I would. I mean, never say never, right? Because situations change and circumstances change, and just because things have been built doesn't mean that they can't be taken down. I mean, that's in fact what has happened. That happened in Gaza. It happened in the Sinai. It's happened in other places around the world. Yes, it seems very unlikely now, but
it would require a civil war in Israel.
That's true. And Tom Friedman, of all people, has written that it might require a civil war in Israel, and that's true. As you say, a one-state solution seems completely ridiculous now because these people don't want to live next to each other. There are, something could be enforced from without. Is another option. But at the end of the day, and again, I mean, I'm not making an equivalency, Andrew. I'm just using a historical analogy, right? For many, many people, the idea that if you had looked at Europe in 1939 or at any point, in the 10 years that followed it, and the 10 and the 100 or 1,000 years that preceded it, the idea that you wouldn't need a passport to go between Germany and France and Italy would have been out of the realm of possibility. Centuries of catastrophic bloodletting leading to the two worst conflagrations in human history, based on, by the way, the second one, deeply held ideological ideas. In our opinion, in your opinion, in my opinion, I'm sure, insane ideas. Totalitarianism and fascism and Nazism, the same kinds of ideas that animate the most extreme people in Israel and Palestine now. And of course, now it's unimaginable to us that was the situation. So I guess I don't want to lose our political imagination. You're right. These things seem impossible now. You have to keep preparing the ground for a day when that might change. But it would be hubris to think that they can't change. And the example of Europe and the 20th century, I think, is a good one to keep in mind, that don't ever think it's impossible that things are going to change.
Well, can we talk about Israel? We continue to, although I think more and more people are actually sick of it now. They've got other things to think about. But there's a new edition of Daniel Sokatch's 2021 book, a guide for the curious, confused, and conflicted. I think people are more, I don't know if they're more curious, but they're certainly, as I said, more confused and conflicted. We will talk again, Daniel. I hope the news is better. I'm not positive. I'm not very optimistic, but you're more hopeful. I hope you're right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andrew. It's always good to be on with you.